Neurotic Literature by James Lark. This story: Rectangles. Folklore tells of a town where everyone was a mathematician. Each person was an expert, whether in arithmetic, algebra, geometry, or topology, because for centuries these skills had been passed from generation to generation, and every child was brought up an expert as a matter of course. Being mathematicians, they were careful to allot different skills from birth according to what was needed. It wouldn't do, they agreed, for everyone to be able to solve quadratic equations if nobody knew how to put up shelves at the correct angle. So each area of maths was represented by an equal percentage of mathematicians, as decreed by the statisticians. That is the kind of rigorous approach they took to everything. Measurements were very precisely measured, definitions very precisely defined, and costs very precisely calculated. The layout of the streets and buildings had an elegant geometrical form. Nobody was ever even half a minute late for a meeting, and because they were also good at accounting, they were always comfortably wealthy. And yes, the shelves were invariably at a perfect angle, though, being mathematicians, they understood that perfection itself was subject to a tiny and acceptable level of inconsistency. If that all sounds rather dull and clinical to you, then you must understand that to them it was a way of life, a birthright even. As soon as the statisticians had decided the branch of mathematics in which a child was to become an expert, that child would be given educational toys to encourage and develop their understanding of the topic. You know the sort of thing. An abacus, building blocks carved with symbols for constructing imaginary numbers, or that game where wooden shapes have to be pushed through the correct hole in a box. This story is about a child called Simplex, who was going to grow up to be an expert in topology, and was therefore the happy recipient of the wooden shape game. One day, when he was still very young, Simplex was pushing shapes through the little holes and managed, quite by accident, to fit the square brick through the rectangular hole. His parents, who were watching when it happened, were alarmed. They knew that pushing squares through the rectangle hole was the kind of thing that could lead to sloppy thinking, the kind of imprecision that could threaten the principles their town was quite literally built on. So they removed the square brick from the box and gave it back to Simplex, telling him to try again. A square is not a rectangle, they said. Poor Simplex was too young to understand this, and I'm afraid his parents were forced to punish him on more than one occasion when they caught him putting the square brick through the rectangle hole. He soon learned an important lesson, which was to put the square brick through the rectangular hole only when his parents weren't looking. The years wore on, and Simplex grew up to be a fine mathematician, one who specialised in the study of quadrilaterals. He was fascinated by squares and rectangles, and continued to explore them in the light of his expert understanding of low-dimensional manifolds and uniformization theorems. The attitude of his parents had taught him to be cautious when it came to challenging the town's ancient mathematical knowledge, but one day, after years of complex analysis and elementary proofs, after checking and double-checking, one day, when he was absolutely certain, he made an announcement. "A square," he said, "is a rectangle." The townspeople were outraged. "We've had a perfect understanding of rectangles since mathematics was first invented," they angrily told him. "What right do you have to challenge it?" "I have spent my entire life working with quadrilaterals," Simplex pointed out. "That does not entitle you to turn the world of topology on its head," they cried. "I'm not exactly turning it on its head," Simplex explained, getting out a blackboard so that he could show them. "You see, a rectangle is a four-sided shape in which all the angles are 90 degrees. Now, a square," he drew a square is also a four-sided shape with four 90-degree angles. The equality of its sides doesn't stop it from being a rectangle." This demonstration caused great consternation amongst the crowd, many of whom were so offended by the logical proof in front of them that they had to turn their back on it. "Abstract nonsense!" shouted one mathematician, and the crowd took up the cry, declaring Simplex's hypothesis to be unnatural and irregular. It fell to Generic, one of the elders of the town, to restore order. "Now then, young Simplex," he said with a beneficent smile. Simplex found this rather patronising because he wasn't even that young by then, certainly not relative to the mean, which Generic ought to have known, being a mathematician. "It's a fine conjecture and a compelling argument," he continued, "but it won't do at all. You see, if we begin defining squares as rectangles and rectangles as squares—" Simplex coughed politely. "Actually," he explained, "rectangles aren't squares on account of the variable length of their sides." "Oh, so a square gets to be a rectangle, but a rectangle can't be a square," shouted someone in the crowd. "So much for equality." "It's not about equality," explained Simplex. "It is about mathematical sense." Now, Generic said reprovingly, "that's enough arguing." He gave Simplex an encouraging smile. "I know that you're only arguing for squares to be considered rectangles, but don't you see that before long other people will start saying rectangles are squares as well? Then we'll have to say that triangles are rectangles. We'll start including circles and trapezoids and polygons under the same heading. There's no knowing where it will end." He patted Simplex on the shoulder. "It might sound like the right thing to do, but we'd be changing the acceptable level of inconsistency in our definition of perfection, and that will cause problems when it comes to putting shelves up at the correct angle." Generic asked the crowd to applaud the hard work Simplex had put in, saying that mathematics was worthless without the occasional discussion. Then he told them to disperse, happy in the knowledge that their wisdom had been challenged and upheld, and was all the stronger for it. And with that, he believed, he had put the whole matter to rest. In fact, he was put to rest himself a week later, so was never any the wiser. But the seeds of doubt had been sown. Plenty of people had been listening carefully, looking at the blackboard and making back-of-the-envelope calculations of their own. Some of them already felt doubts about squares and rectangles, and were quite relieved that somebody had finally been brave enough to say something. So, for every 10 mathematicians who walked away shaking their heads and muttering about the arrogance of people nowadays, there was at least one, some thought as many as 1.5, who went away determined to subject rectangles to their own analysis. Simplex, by the way, had not expected any of this fuss. He had, remember, spent his whole life seeing squares differently to everyone else, so perhaps he was unable to appreciate what a difficult concept it was for people to take in. At the end of the day, he had no desire to inspire a revolution, in the insurgent rather than the mathematical sense of the word. He wanted to get on with quietly being an expert, and if nobody else had his understanding, then it was no skin off his nose. But he felt a certain indignation stirring within him when he discovered that his parents were refusing to talk to him because of his announcement, and when a group of mathematicians approached him and said they were wholeheartedly behind his new theorem, and asked if he would do them the honour of presenting a series of lectures and debates on the issue, he decided he would relish the chance to explain his views properly. After all, nobody could explain them better. At first, those in favour of the inclusion of squareness into rectangularity were brushed off with terse disapproval or mocking laughter. But as the discussion gathered momentum, others opposed to their views grew alarmed and became more vocal. They warned the townspeople what would happen if the definition of rectangularity was changed. It wasn't, they explained with dwindling patience, simply a matter of shelves being put up at irregular angles, though everyone owned plenty of books and could surely imagine the chaos that would cause. It was important that people considered the long-term effects of adopting this decadent, liberal approach. For, the critics reminded everyone, their entire outlook depended on rigour and precision. Without it, people would arrive late for meetings, and the calculations that ensured their wealth would give way to guesswork and risk-taking. The elegant, geometrical construction of the streets would be eroded, and sooner or later the buildings would collapse. They would be left in poverty and chaos, ending centuries of mathematical expertise. This theorem, this devaluation of definition, would herald the end for their entire culture. Simplex and his supporters continued to discuss their views, working late into the night with protractors and, though it was a slow and difficult process, gradually winning over the townspeople. Eventually, and by this time you must understand, Simplex was an old man, barely able to hold a protractor for himself, but even so, eventually, it was agreed by referendum that a square was indeed a rectangle and ought to be defined as such. There were protests, there were petitions, there were letters of complaint, and there were banners painted saying, "Squares do not fit into the rectangle hole." It was an insult to mathematical expertise, said the critics. It was an insult to common sense. It was an insult to the work on rectangles that their parents and their parents' parents had done. Everyone else accepted the new definition with ease, and they were delighted to discover that it enriched both their understanding of mathematics and their lives. Simplex died a respected mathematician, loved by many, and surrounded by a large family of expert mathematicians who felt honoured to continue his work. But before he died, he was able to witness buildings that embraced the rectangularity of squares springing up, giving a new architectural lease of life to the streets. There were still those who would not accept it. They weren't interested in trying to understand why a square might be considered a rectangle. Historically speaking, they felt that a square was a square, a rectangle was a rectangle, and since the two had never been mixed up in the past, it was quite wrong that they were getting mixed up now. "You wait," they would grumble to anyone who would listen, usually each other. "It's only a matter of time before somebody stops bothering to ensure their bijections are surjective, and then where will we be?" They wrote long, vitriolic articles about the hedonism and egotism that had ruined mathematics forever, until one by one they died, grumbling to the last. So it was that life in the town went on, rigorous, precise, punctual, and comfortably wealthy. Shelves continued to be put up at the correct angle, and the buildings did not fall down. Before very long, everyone had forgotten that squares had ever been treated differently. You have been listening to Neurotic Literature, written and performed by me, James Lark. I hope you've enjoyed it, and if you have, you can spread the word. Tell your friends and family to listen in, or tell random people you don't know on social media. You can also encourage people to listen to episodes by leaving a review on your podcast platform of choice. If you haven't enjoyed it, you're obviously very committed to not enjoying it, having listened all the way through, and you can stop me from releasing any further podcasts by donating at ko-fi.com/neurotic literature. Make it a really big donation, and I'm bound to start leading a complacent life of luxury, and all of my artistic endeavours will cease, so you'll never have to hear from me again.